I'm going to jump in with the San Francisco Public Library announcements. I'm Anissa. I'm your librarian host here at San Francisco Public Library. And we want to thank you for being here today and attending this amazing event. We are so thankful to have the McEvoy Foundation for the Arts as partners. Today's event is a larger part of our One City, One Book event, which we have, it's our 16th One City, One Book, and we've selected author Chanel Miller. And this is the story of her sexual assault and the subsequent dealings with the court and the judicial system, and her surviving this and her growing and becoming a champion and advocate, and all of the things she does that are amazing. Right now, you can see her artwork from Hyde Street at the Asian Art Museum. So Chanel Miller will be in conversation with journalist Robin Takayama on March 16th. This is a one-time and one-time only event. So please ensure that you come to the event, register, or catch it live on YouTube, but there will not be an archive of it. So please check it out. And we have amazing partners. We get to do amazing things with this event. So please come check it out. And we want to welcome you to the unceded land of the Ohlone Ramaytush tribal people. I acknowledge the many Ramaytush Ohlone tribal groups as the rightful stewards in the lands in which we reside here in our Bay Area. SFPL is committed to uplifting the names of these families and providing factual and useful information, as well as many programs around Indigenous peoples. So please come check out the library. If this is your first time checking out a virtual event, we are here practically every day doing programs. We miss you and we encourage you to come check out our site. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Susan Miller, the Executive Director of the McEvoy Foundation for the Arts. Susan.
Hello, everyone. Good day, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you. My name is Susan Miller. I'm the Executive Director of McEvoy Foundation for the Arts. I'm here to welcome you to this very special conversation with Celeste-Marie Bernier, Judith Butler, and Isaac Julien. This event, as Anissa said, is co-produced by the San Francisco Public Library and McEvoy Arts in San Francisco. Our very talented and insightful thinkers have been invited today to share and exchange on the life and legacy of Frederick Douglass, his view on the power and role of language and visual representation in racial and social justice movements, and the importance of a few of the women in Douglass's life, without whom he would not be the person we know today. This conversation is the final public program held in conjunction with the exhibition Lessons of the Hour, Isaac Julien's project on view at McEvoy Arts. It will remain on view through April 24th. And if you would like to make a reservation, please check our website at mcevoyarts.org. I'd like to thank our speakers, as well as the leadership and staff of the San Francisco Public Library and McEvoy Arts. We are deeply grateful as well to Naim McEvoy, Leslie Berriman, and the McEvoy family for their generous commitment to the arts in support of this program. Finally, our conversation will include a question and answer session at the end. We'll do our best to address as many as possible, but please share your questions in the Q&A button. Now I'd like to introduce our very special guest speakers. Please reference the chat for their complete bios. Celeste-Marie Bernier is an art historian and scholar who has authored numerous publications on Frederick Douglass and Black visual arts traditions. Forthcoming publications include Battleground, African American Art, 1985 to 2015, from the University of Georgia Press in 2021, and Anna Murray and Frederick Douglass Family Papers and Douglass Family Lives, the biography. Currently, she is in progress on Living Parchments, Artistry and Authorship in the Life and Works of Frederick Douglass from Yale University Press. Bringing her knowledge and scholarship on Douglass's speeches, she was a key contributor and collaborator on Isaac Julien's Lessons of the Hour. She's professor of United States and Atlantic Studies at the University of Edinburgh. Judith Butler is the author of more than 20 groundbreaking books that have been translated into numerous languages, including Gender Trouble from 1990, Excitable Speech from 1997, Notes Towards a Performative Theory of Assembly in 2015, and The Force of Nonviolence in 2020. She is the Maxine Elliott Professor in the Department of Comparative Literature and the founding director of the Critical Theory Program, as well as the International Consortium of Critical Theory Programs at UC Berkeley, funded by the McEvoy Foundation. And finally, Isaac Julien is a British filmmaker and installation artist whose artworks exploring historical figures have produced numerous landmark projects, including a documentary drama on Langston Hughes, which won him a prize at Cannes Film Festival, and others on Frantz Fanon, Frederick Douglass, and Lino Babbardi. His work has been exhibited around the globe, including at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, the Pompidou Center in Paris, and the Venice Biennale. He is Distinguished Professor of Arts at UC Santa Cruz. So without further delay, I thank you all and welcome Celeste, Judith, and Isaac. Please begin when you are ready.
Welcome, everybody. Isaac, do you want to introduce us to this project and say a few words?
Sure, of course. I'd love to do that. I'm just to say that I'm so excited to have both yourself here, Judith, and Celeste. You know, it's a bit of a dream come true. And I should say that, you know, there would not be anything of Lessons of the Hour without Celeste-Marie Bernier's scholarship. She completely led the way for me. And her work for me was really, you know, I mean, there would be no project without her scholarship and work, which I'm incredibly indebted to. And her generosity in sharing her sort of knowledge of Douglass was what really enabled me to make this project. So thank you, Celeste.
Thank you.
Yeah, and incredibly excited as well, you know, of Judith being here as well, because, you know, I followed your work for, you know, long time, Judith, ever since my early days in Santa Cruz in the early 90s. And so it's a great honor to have you both in conversation with this project, Lessons of the Hour. And I would just say that in a way, it wasn't really until, because when you're making a project like this, you're ostensibly kind of looking at all of these research materials, but, you know, somebody has to make it come to life, you know. And, you know, it was Celeste's work, which, and my conversations with her, which brought the project to life for me. Especially, of course, the relationship between debates around photography and, as Judith had mentioned, in a sense, Douglas's lecture on pictures and his lecture in relationship to progress in pictures, they were made for me to a certain extent. Thinking about my early works like Looking for Langston and the relationship between photography. But I think obviously with Douglass, I was very sort of moved by his language, the use of language. And so, and your work in relationship to that for me was incredible. Your work with the archives, Celeste, was really phenomenal. But I guess one of the things I was really struck by was his speech, to Slavery the 4th of July. And that speech for me is pivotal because it embodies so many questions around questions of citizenship, of, you know, nationness or nationhood, and if you like, the sort of abolitionist slaves position that's so really articulated. So I think, I don't know, I feel we should begin with that and we can springboard.
Let's definitely begin with that.
Yeah. Thank you.
And in the still darkness of midnight, I have often been aroused by the dead heavy footsteps and the piteous cries of the chain gangs that passed our door. to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him more than all the other days in the year the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham. Your boasted liberty, an unholy license. Your nation's greatness, swelling vanity. Your sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless. Your denunciation of tyrants, brass-fronted impudence. Your shouts of liberty and equality, hollow mockery. Prayers and your hymns, your sermons and your thanksgivings, with all your religious parade and solemnity, are to him mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy. A thin veil to cover up crimes which would disgrace a nation of savages. There is not a nation on earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people in these United States in this very hour.
Isaac, you know, I was thinking, of course, many of us have taught this particular speech, and it's considered to be a brilliant example of rhetoric. It's also arguably a text in philosophy. It's also a political protest. He's complying with the invitation to address this crowd on July 4th, but he's unable to celebrate with them. He's unable to make them feel better about themselves, to placate them, even the white abolitionists among them. And yet it's also, it seems to me, given that this is part of your installation piece, it's also a visual experience that we have of a scene that you've produced for us. So it is at once, I would say, rhetoric, philosophy, protest, and photography. We have all of those genres, those medias with us here, and it's quite powerful. I mean, it's powerful as rhetoric because if you read the whole thing, he's saying, oh, you're celebrating, da 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 da, but he's also not celebrating with them, and he's also saying, what could your holiday mean to me? Separating the you from the I, suggesting that this nation, whoever the you and the I is here, this nation is still riven by race. And at the time of this particular lecture, radically broken by race. And then it seems to me that you give a video representation of this that draws on his ideas of photography, but also your own. So we go from photography to video when moving from Douglass to Julien, and it's quite remarkable to see it staged in this particular way. He seems to be of them, but he's separate from them. I wonder you or Celeste has something to say about that.
Well, I would say that a lot of the kind of theories in relationship to Douglass, which have been extrapolated, in Celeste's scholarship on Douglass, I was able to kind of borrow. And I guess in this scenography and presentational sort of aspect of the work, one is juxtaposing the question of kind of rhetoric and the kind of, in a way, philosophical sort of political sort of activism of Douglass, and in a way transposing that with the contemporaneous events. This work was made in 2019. It draws from both surveillance footage from the FBI, and at the same time the sort of riots which occurred in Baltimore, during the Freddie Gray riots. And so there's a way in which one's able to juxtapose all of those things in relationship to this speech which I think resonates and pours out all of the sort of, if you like, the kind of difficulties of being able to have this triumphalist vision of the nation, and to contest that from, if you like, slaves, like philosophers' position. And I think there's a way that Douglass really is able to give this as a kind of radical sort of proclamation, which feels, even to this very day, incredibly radical. It's not a kind of statement that one hears in this sort of everyday manner necessarily. So I think there's a way in which he's really, through the use of language, he's just able to bring this reading, which is incredibly pertinent. So yeah. And I know that sort of Celeste had many conversations with Ray Ferron, the kind of Royal Black Shakespearean actor, who he is obsessed with language himself, recognized all the Shakespearean tropes in Douglass's work and all its 19th century aspects straight away, but was absolutely, I think, beside himself and Celeste, maybe you can share those conversations and your ideas, but I think this gave him the kind of interiority that he needed for this performative aspect.
Great. Celeste, do you want to chime in?
I think it's so beautiful, everything you're both saying, Judith and Isaac. And Isaac, your film is just a beautiful, beautiful jugular vein to the heart of Douglass's power, his activism, his oratory, and his artistry. And what I am in total awe in your beautiful film, so many things, but what keeps me going and inspires me on is the power and force of your beautiful film in working in so many languages, so many performances, to encapsulate the many Douglasses that is so at the heart of the conversations I had with Ray Ferron too. And thinking through, Douglass lived by two convictions: that language was life in the face of existential death, that language was the way out of, as he said, my mental suffering in slavery was 10,000 agonies more than my physical suffering. So language for Douglass, as he described it, was words as things, as activism in the social justice arsenal. But at the same time, in his moments of pain, and what is so beautiful and powerful in your film, Isaac, is you move beautifully between the pain of the public Douglass and the pain of the private Douglass, and the power in that pain. And Douglass himself said privately, language is cold, valueless, and lifeless when I think of those of my people who live and die in slavery. So what is so powerful and beautiful in what you create and how you communicate in this film, Isaac, is Douglass's many lessons, his many languages, and the ways in which he communicates his embodiment and his physicality, and also his imaginative literary power of selfhood.
I would add to that if Douglass thought language was survival, he thought photography promised dignity, and had this really remarkable view on pictures. He wrote, as you know, a really important essay on pictures and progress, that pictures somehow reveal the subjective nature of a person. They render it objective for others to know and to recognize. And he really believed that there was both a transparency and a power of externalization in photography, that he could be known, which is why he so willingly sat for so many portraits, more photographic portraits than any human in the 19th century, the number of which exceeds Abraham Lincoln, the portraits of Abraham Lincoln. So that's quite remarkable. I mean, he really did think something about humanity could be affirmed through the photograph, even as he obviously suffered from pictures of him, caricatures, drawings, but also photographs that exaggerated his features and were clearly racist, even among the abolitionists who sought to defend him or to present his humanity. He didn't want to be assimilated into that narrative of liberation and to be appropriated by those particular images. And by sitting for the portrait, it seemed as if he was perhaps asserting his dignity or gaining ownership over his own story. I don't know if you would say he was successful in doing that, but it's one reason I'm struck here by the combination of language and visual, both pictures and video and performance here. And of course, we also moved to song. There's an extraordinary soundtrack throughout this installation. We haven't talked about the acoustic yet, but it's quite central.
Yes, I mean, I think there's a way in which, if we think about the sort of ways in which songs and pictures become this sort of way of really him having some kind of agency of being able to both kind of in terms of the narcissistic wounding, which is performed by the apparatus of photography in terms of the general articulation of it, in terms of producing these images, which, to an extent, to this very day, that a Black population, in a way, still suffers from. And then if you think about the ways in which he wanted to ingrain within this idea of, himself being at one time a fugitive slave, and then these early photographic images, which had a kind of, if you like, fugitive image. I think this is something that Celeste has written about. That question of the ephemeral, and at the same time, his constant photographing himself. I think this is extraordinary, really. And his theories around, of course, constitute a kind of aesthetic theory, if you bring all of the essays together on photography. But I think there's a way in which, if we turn to song, I mean, this is where kind of, in Celeste's work, I really felt this real embodiment of how the soul is able to transport itself and keep itself alive when exiled to a certain extent to these other spaces. And of course, I mean, there's a way in which even in Scotland, in Edinburgh, where we shot, there's a way in which these ballads, which are now part of the fabric of, the history, have Douglass at the center of them in the Send Back the Money campaign. And of course, people look at the work and they think, well, what is Send Back the Money? What was this campaign? And I mean, really is this entwining, I would say, of the kind of national, transracial alliancing that he was trying to assemble in this plight for his freedom, and in a sense was successful. And of course, I mean, Celeste, you've written about this, so elegantly.
Should we get the clip and Celeste can talk to us about it?
Please.
Send back the money, send it back, tempt not the Negro's God, to blast and weather Scotland's church with his avenging rod. There's no a might in all the sum, but cries to heaven aloud, for wrath and all who shield the men not trade in Negro's blood.
Yesterday, Eliza and I rose at 4, and armed with string and staves, and with Douglas quite laden down with all the tools we could muster, without alarming the household, we set out to climb a fair way up Arthur's Seat. Eliza chose the place, and wasting not 1 minute, we began to mark out our slogan.
Ways me, you're getting warm, warm, my kind mammy. You're foaming like a keg o' barm, my kind mammy.
Shall I as free as ocean waves shake hands with women shipping knaves, and build kirks with the blood of slaves? Send back the money.
This moment in your film is so spellbinding, Isaac, and the power and the force of it brings to life Douglas's many wars. And as he said, he was a veteran of every social justice struggle. And at the heart of his work in Scotland, he stands before an audience of 2,000 people in Edinburgh, and he is disheartened and desolate at how white people, even those pretending to support the abolitionist cause, commit racism, commit supremacist violations. And so he stands in front of them and he says, send back the money. Know that in my bones, in my sinew, in my spirit, and in my heart, you are buying and selling my people. So send back the money became the refrain by which he condemned the Free Church of Scotland, who were profiting, taking money from white enslavers in the US South and using it to build up their churches. And his way, as he understood it, of working out who was a whole soul and who was a half soul in the freedom struggle, and a way of combating the different ways in which enslaved people, self-liberated campaigners, were subjected to violence and violation in a freedom that was in name only. And so, as he said it, we may have failed to send back the money, but we set Scotland on fire.
That's Celeste. Well, I was completely, of course, these are all stories that we don't know about in the UK. And, I think there's a way in making this work of trying to bridge the kind of transnational Douglass, to try to connect that, of course, in its trajectory and roots in relationship to the slave trade, which, of course, all lead back to imperial cities. And in a way, Douglass was there in that imperial city doing that work of undoing the nation in terms of its empire and its relationship to his being. But I felt it was incredibly strong that you had these ballads, and he often spoke about the preference to ballads as a description of the nation, as opposed to its laws, to a certain extent, as a description, and a way of describing and rearticulating his sense of freedom.
Sorry. I'm wondering if we could talk a little bit about the women who gathered behind Douglass or who supported him, but also the women activists with whom he was closely bound up. We know that he really cared about women gaining the right to vote, becoming full citizens, and he linked the struggles against slavery and racism to the enfranchisement of women. Are these separate struggles? Are there Black women in this picture? Are all the women white? How do we think about this part of his work, and both the women who were intimately linked to him and his broader commitments to the suffragist struggle?
Celeste.
So this is, and so beautiful. We have your breathtaking still here of Anna Murray Douglass. And so Anna Murray Douglass was Mother Douglass, as Douglass called her, and as the children, their 5 children, called her. And she was a political freedom fighter, an intellectual genius, and an anti-slavery orator and activist who undergirded the Douglass family, who we talk a lot of the Douglass voice, but the Douglass voice is made up of Anna Murray and Charles Raymond, who we just saw in the last slide, and in Rosetta Douglass, and Frederick Douglass Jr., and in Lewis Henry Douglass, who together were the Douglass voice of intergenerational liberation. And Anna Murray Douglass left us very little in terms of her words in the archive, but the words she does leave us are words to live by. One of the phrases that she says is, "Why not I endure hardship that my race may be free? My husband is battling with the minions of oppression, but I will keep my family alive." And so Anna Murray Douglass sacrificed everything. And as Lewis Henry, as Rosetta, as Frederick Jr., they all knew that her part and their part in the white supremacist archive of 2021, in the white supremacist archive in 1895, when Douglass passes, would obliterate, deny their trace. And Lewis, just a month before he dies, he fought as a distinguished combat soldier in the Civil War, and he finally died of his injuries many years later. And in his final letter, in his shaky handwriting, he says, "No one knew what the distresses, anxieties, hardships, and struggles were that we had to undergo in the struggle for liberty. My mother gave everything she had to the freedom struggle."
No.
Isaac, do you want to join in there?
No, I mean, it's just, I think, the role of women in Douglass's life, for me, as encapsulated, by Celeste's description in terms of the familiar sort of infrastructure that provided Douglass's agency and autonomy. I just, in a way, in the exhibition at least, this is something that I really wanted to foreground. Anna Murray Douglass, of course, was not the most photographed subject, and nor was Helen Pitt, who in a way I think was at the kind of, really created a kind of legacy as well for Douglass today. And of course, it was incredibly controversial that he had a white wife, but this is someone who, of course, that I sort of learned through Celeste's scholarship, had, really, been at the forefront of abolitionist work. She knew exactly what she was doing, and she created that kind of legacy of that transaction of, would be seen as transgressive interracial alliances, which would foreground Douglass's legacy, in the fight for equality. And so, and I guess, there is a kind of repression, I think, in Helen Pitt's narrative, and the role, that, the progressive aspects of the white race had to play in the liberation and the fight for abolitionism. And I think there's, so, I mean, of course, you try to translate all these codes through photography, through her intensity in relationship to reading and literature and the role of language, and how those are all used as a kind of force. But okay, I guess it's a kind of privacy and intimacy and those moments, which I'm also trying to instill. Obviously, she outlived Douglass. Yeah, so.
Maybe, I mean, I'm struck by the fact that, when he gave that lecture in, what was it, 1852, what to the slave is the 4th of July, it was to the Ladies' Anti-Slavery Society in Rochester, if I'm not mistaken. And I mean, on the one hand, these are the mainly white women who are struggling to abolish slavery. On the other hand, he doesn't want to be captured by them and made into a kind of icon for their cause. So he's not making full solidarity with his audience, even though his audience is trying to represent him, or maybe precisely because his audience is trying to represent him. So seems to me there's like some tension there, and maybe Douglass also has an idea of dignity and freedom. I don't know if we could call it masculinist, or, I mean, he did more than so many to think about women's suffrage, but at the same time, is there not a kind of masculinism that runs through?
I mean, yeah, I mean, I think, of course, I mean, I think there is a masculinity or masculinist aspect in relationship to, both his relationship, to women, in that sense, he's a 19th century man. And I think also at the same time, there's a way in which he is, at the forefront of trying to create these alliances, which have their tensions, because of course, in the case of Susan B. Anthony, there is that historical contestation where he chooses his identity, as a man in relationship to the race to vote, against the kind of suffragist core, for the repudiation of those laws that would not allow women, to have the position to vote, and so, and I think about this sort of gender racial hierarchy in relationship to the law and the letter, and I think ostensibly about the rerun of those things into the 20th century, the 21st century, when we think about Obama and Hillary Clinton, or we think about the ways in which those get rolled out, even currently between Biden and Harris, they're all kind of there in relationship to this question of masculinity and the gendered role aspect in the political, in the body politic sense. And so, and, I think in the work, one tries to bring out these different questions of the role of modernity, the kind of way in which, Anna Murray Douglass is, is able to construct the Douglass image through her labor of creating his costumes, through the technology of the sewing machine, and he's able to travel and have that agency on the train. I mean, there are these sorts of comparisons. There's a kind of, in a way, gender critique that I'm trying to bring into the work, realizing that question of mobility was afforded to him, the relationship to photography was afforded to him, in a way that, that comes at a particular price. And so I think, yeah, I mean, these are the aspects which, are still reverberating, I would argue, which I'm trying to foreground in these kind of images and presentations.
Celeste, would you like to talk a little bit more on that issue?
I think the power of the film and the beautiful stills we see here that show Anna Murray Douglass at the sewing machine and speaks to the intergenerational struggle, especially of the women in the Douglass family, that, as you spoke about so beautifully, Douglass carries. And a person we haven't spoken so much about, but who's in some of the historical photographs here, is also Rosetta Douglass, his eldest daughter. And she was here she is here, and she, from the age of 11, was proofreading and editing the North Star as newspaper. And just before she died, she'd entirely lost her sight working on her magnum opus, which was the first history of Black radical feminism in 1902. And one of the powerful life forces intellectually and philosophically on Douglass and his thinking around women's rights. And you talk beautifully, Judith, about those tensions and difficulties, and you too, Isaac, with Susan B. Anthony as well. The foundational thinkers were Anna Murray and Rosetta Douglass in thinking through, in 1870, an intersectional way of understanding the freedom struggle and feminist rights that understood and took parts of Susan B. Anthony but held them to account and were unequivocal around racist issues that carried through. So the bleed through of the injustice through racism really is a foundation of a new feminism that the Douglass women, especially Anna Murray and Rosetta, were committed to.
I'm reminded, I hope that this is true, you'll tell me historically, that Douglass, on the day of his death, attended a demonstration for suffrage, went home exhausted and died. And that was his last act, which, is really quite remarkable. I'm wondering if we could move in the time that's left to think about the resonance of Douglass with the present. Throughout this video installation, you all of you who worked on this, show the resonances. You juxtapose lynching with the death of Freddie Gray in 2015 and the demonstrations that followed, the threat of the police, the ongoing threat of the police. And even in the lecture, What to the Slave is the 4th of July, there is this moment where Douglass, although he looks like he's like this full human, he's not yet emancipated, as I understand it, says, in this hour, this remains true. He's not just telling a history, it's in this hour. And somehow when those words come through in the gallery space where the installation is taking place, it's in this hour too, in our very hour. And maybe, Isaac, you can talk a little bit about how you wanted to have Douglass illuminate the present, or how you wanted the present to illuminate dimensions of Douglass that may not be widely known.
Well, thank you, Judith. I mean, I think there's a way in which, making this work, there was the kind of possibility to have a retort to the ways in which one was experiencing, I think, the kind of resurgence of a kind of hyperbolic kind of racism that became the kind of focal center for the kind of, Trump campaign, the Brexit campaign. There's a way in which in the UK, US sort of access that you have this sort of real kind of return to questions, which are kind of pivotal questions, and all of the work, that we've been involved in. I would say the work with, Stuart Hall, Paul Gilroy, and Hazel Vicarby. I mean, across the kind of what I want to call Black Atlantic world, you have this kind of resurgent rearticulation of a kind of vicious kind of racism, in Europe. And so I think in the making of the work, what was really important was how to coalesce and to work with this kind of question of temporality and time, to resuture all of these moments, both historical and the contemporaneous, to show actually that this long march, towards equality, but in a way, I think also in the installation and how it's very much influenced or interpolated by 19th century salon hang. It's really in the 21st century, it still is to a certain extent images which lead a form of a certain activism. And we saw that last year in that terrible, horrendous atrocity that happened. It reignited, that whole Black Lives movement. And so I think, it's a way of trying to create this kind of synergy in works like this, and to, and the question of language and a kind of sophistication around the theory of the medium that Douglass had, presented in the eve of the advent of these technologies, which they resonate in such a peculiar way now in the new technologies as well, and so, and yeah, I mean, it's as problematic then as it was now as it was then to a certain extent, one could say, in terms of the way in which these technologies are going to be appropriated and used, both for and against to a certain extent. So, and these were some of the ideas, which were in a sense inspired by Douglass's sort of speech for me in the making of the work.
Celeste, do you want to talk about the resonance with the present?
I think the just breathtaking power of the film, Isaac, in how you do those staggering juxtapositions that cut to the heart of the life force of the Douglass we need today, as his daughter described it in 1900, thinks very much in the fact of your calling your beautiful film Lessons of the Hour, which is a speech Douglass agonized over and exists in 10 forms, and is a speech that he revisited just before he died. And he crosses out the rise of the spirit of slavery, which is what he understood as white supremacy, white persecution, white torture, white murder, and he replaces it with the word, the spirit of mastery. And so his understanding of that stranglehold of vicious racism, disenfranchisement, dehumanizing persecution, to the day he died, he understood. And one of the most powerful phrases he says is, as we go forward in the freedom struggle, nothing of liberty, humanity, or justice will come to us except through tears and blood. So that notion Douglass had of the ongoing fight in liberation as at its artery, activism and art together as transformative, is beautifully encapsulated in everything you do in this film.
One of the videos that I thought was most powerful on that question of the utter sadism of white supremacy, the relentless sadism, the relentless cruelty, was the one where the hands were picking cotton and there's a sound of a whip in the background. I don't know if we can show that. I don't know if we're set up to show that, but I would suggest that people have a look if they can. I also think there is some way, some people say, well, Douglass didn't believe in reason, or he was trying to get to feeling. And I think that he was making arguments that led to an understanding of that cruelty so we could feel it, but that it wasn't exactly a tension between reason and language on the one hand, and feeling and art on the other. I think that they actually were intertwined in a very powerful way. So we're led through the argument to the experience or we at least approach the experience of astonishing cruelty and subjection. And I do think that this is part of the emotional power of his language, his lectures, but also of Isaac's work, which I believe gives us a history, gives us a set of juxtapositions between the past and the present, but also brings us face to face with the continuing relentless rhythm of brutality, of racist brutality. And we get that both through sound, we get it through image, and we get it through language. Isaac, we have just a few minutes left. You want to show us something or say something?
Well, no, I mean, I think this question of sadism, Judith, is so kind of correct. I think, in a psychoanalytic sense, questions of like sadism, and desire, and if you like, the kind of pleasure which is kind of extracted, from it, for a white populace who wants to maintain power. I think this is unquestionably one of the sort of aspects which is so kind of difficult to grasp and understand. And at the same time, we had such a kind of powerful masquerading of that recently, kind of in relationship to the acts which were wanted, the acts that were desired to be committed in the Senate, and people have been arguing could be committed again. And I think, this question of sadism, which is that Douglass is repudiating, but is in a way painfully and at the same time eloquently articulating, is, it is a kind of, well, it's both a moment of disavow generally in the culture, but then at the same time in art, when you're approaching it, you're trying to recover that in what I want to call the aesthetics of reparation. And so I think that's one of the things, that I'm trying to develop in the making of these works and images.
So someone else is going to enter now to take questions from the audience. Is that you, Susan? Okay.
Yes. Can you all see me? We just have a few minutes here. You guys have, thank you so much. You've touched on so many beautiful topics. And thank you, Judith, for jockeying here and providing so much interesting input to everyone. I wanted to take a quick moment. There is one question in the audience that's about the relationship of the viewer, Isaac, and the collective as it's presented on the screen. So there's this jockeying that happens between Douglass and others, and between us, the viewer, and the work itself, and how those relationships are embellished in the work. I wondered if you were something you'd like to say a little bit more about the construction of the piece and what you were thinking about as you played with those topics.
Well, I think it's really more about the kind of being able, in this sort of schematic visual sense, have the sort of juxtapositions, which it enables you to have this kind of multi access to time, the question of time and temporalities, which are coexisting, and in a way kind of creating the reactions. But then at the same time, one has all one's theories about a mobile spectator and looking and contesting the kind of linearity of sort of films and what they ideologically kind of represent in terms of storylines and these sorts of aspects, which, keep a certain normative or conservative way of viewing history, or sort of, and so I think all of these things are in play in the making of the work, and the choice to have these multiple aspects when you're looking. I also think, like within my own practice, I've been interpolated by the new technologies. Even in our screens we're talking now, we have lots of windows open, we have lots of screens. All of this seeps into an artist's subjectivity and work, and I think all of these things are also part of the way in which you can have a really original experience that's very different from that of this more traditional cinema experience, which is very unique to, if you go to the McEvoy, you can have that unique experience.
Make a reservation. Thank you, Isaac. And Judith, a question for you. So might you, and then Celeste, there's a follow-up for you, okay? Can you address how Douglass, as the philosopher, first in with other thinkers before him, and perhaps in his time, how he fits in with a tradition of speech and thinking that comes out of the 19th century and before that, and maybe even touches into the present? And then Celeste, for you, do you know what he was reading in his day? What inspired his speech and thinking? Maybe we can talk a little bit more about that.
I think it would be interesting if Celeste went first, and then I could.
Okay, good, excellent.
Thank you for the beautiful question. Thank you, Susan. Yeah, thank you. Douglass was reading everything. So it takes me back to conversations with Ray Fearon to Isaac, where you spoke about, and those conversations about performativity and performing Douglass. Douglass read, and he read the classics, he read European philosophy, he read ancient philosophy, he read African diasporic philosophy. And for Douglass, as he said, my thinking was my liberation. And so his understanding was that the way to fight back and to win against the political objectivity that happened on the abolitionist podium was to reclaim the imagination. And his main philosophical influence was his mother. So the person who read and who died at 27 was Harriet Bailey. And she communicated to Douglass the urgency of philosophy, practically, intellectually, and as a social justice weapon.
Awesome.
I think given that he did read widely in the classics and in Enlightenment philosophy more generally, and also understood something about American philosophy and emergent transcendentalism, I would say that he was in a bit of a bind as a philosophical thinker, because on the one hand, he inherited these Enlightenment ideals and believed in justice and freedom and equality. At the same time, he saw that those ideals had systematically excluded so many people. I mean, not just the enslaved, but the indigenous and women. And so how then does one reapproach those ideals? Does one throw them out as tainted, or does one use them and reappropriate them in order to expose their limits, their dangers, and their promise, right? And I think that he was navigating that particular dilemma. So I mean, you will find people who say, hey, he's an Enlightenment thinker. I would say an Enlightenment thinker who is a profound critic of Enlightenment philosophy. And I don't know enough about his times in Scotland, but I would sure be interested in knowing more about what he read and what he thought about what he saw there.
Just very quickly to add to what you beautifully said, Judith, Douglass said to a Scottish audience, your enlightenment is enslavement by any other name.
Yes, and then, of course, some of those key concepts reemerge in another form for him as he tries to make formal, even false equality substantive and realizable.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. I think we're going to wrap it now. It's 1 o'clock. Thank you all. We could do this for many hours. We really appreciate your time. Anissa, should I turn it back to you?
Sure. I will just say thank you, and do know that this event is available on our San Francisco YouTube channel, along with our past McEvoy events. And I want